Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Answering your questions tonight, Foreign Editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Communications Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. Journalist and host of the Today Show, Lisa Wilkinson. Civil rights lawyer and capital punishment opponent, Bryan Stevenson, who runs Alabama's Equal Justice Initiative. And the Shadow Minister for Health, Catherine King. Please welcome our panel. Well, remember, if you send us a Twitter question at Quanda to help us find it and put it on air. Facebook followers want us to discuss children in detention. We'll get to that later. Our first question tonight comes from Emily Messer.
When entering Indonesia, everyone must sign a document that clearly states the death penalty as punishment for importing and exporting drugs. So why is it that Australia is putting in so much time and effort to save these two men when they clearly understood the consequences of exporting heroin, but did so anyway?
Bryan Stevenson, let's start with you, because you'd be quite familiar with this argument in the US that if you knew you were breaking the law, you sort of ask for whatever follows.
Well, I think the question of the death penalty isn't really resolved by asking, do people deserve to die for the crimes they commit? It's really not about them. I think the death penalty is a question for society. It's, do we deserve to kill? And the Indonesian government, in my judgment, is doing something quite tragic by executing these people. Most of the people who've been executed in Indonesia are foreign nationals. And when you are different, you are often presumed dangerous and presumed guilty. I come from a country where 84% of the people who've been executed in America are black. There is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that has undermined our use of the death penalty. We have a system that treats you better if you're poor and guilty than if you're rich and innocent. So wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And our country does not deserve to kill. The death penalty is a perfect punishment and it requires a perfect system, and that does not exist in Indonesia. And I think it's actually quite hypocritical for the Indonesian government to be spending millions of dollars to spare Indonesian nationals who are being subject to the death penalty around the world and having a death penalty that primarily executes foreign nationals. Drug dependency is not going to be challenged or overcome with threats of punishment. The people who are heroin addicts aren't thinking about what's the consequence of my using heroin. Countries that have dealt with drug dependency as a health issue have made progress. Those who've dealt with it as a crime issue have made tremendous outcomes of injustice and inequality. And I think that's what we're seeing with the instance of these men in Indonesia now.
Lisa Wilkinson.
I'm very aware that Emily's view is shared by a not insignificant number of Australians, that if you walk through the airport, you know exactly what the consequences are if you are carrying drugs, that death is very much a possibility if you are caught. Many of those people who hold that view are from families who have suffered the consequences of drug addiction and have lost family members and seen lives destroyed. I am a member of a family who has gone through that. So I understand that thinking. However, make no mistake, this is state-sanctioned murder. And I don't believe anybody has the right to take another person's life. Jail has to be about punishment. It has to be about people understanding how wrong the thing is that they have done, but it also has to be about rehabilitation. Otherwise, what is the point? You may as well just kill everybody as soon as you put them in jail. And I think Indonesia, and Bali in particular, is really going to pay the price if they do take the lives of these two men. I think they will suffer a drop in tourism in Bali. But I think also the message that they send to inmates, particularly in Indonesia, is don't do what these guys did, which is work really hard to rehabilitate. They became, as I understand, great mentors to other young prisoners who found their way through what these young men were teaching them. And I think the unrest that will happen amongst the prison population will be significant.
So are you saying essentially that your own personal experience sort of colours your sympathy for what they did, but not your opposition to what's going to happen to them?
It colours my understanding of people who want these two men killed, because if you've seen up close a young life destroyed by drugs, which I have, which my family has, then you want the people who do that work to suffer. I've never wanted to see somebody who does that work die, but You know, certainly the drug laws need looking at, because whatever we've got at the moment, it's not working. The ice problem in this country at the moment is at epidemic levels. So that has to be dealt with. I mean, that's a separate issue. But in this case, I can't sanction murder.
Catherine.
Yeah, look, I think that it's important to understand the concept of redemption as well. You know, we abolished the death penalty in this country because we believe very firmly that our justice system, you know, people deserve to be punished, but we also need to try and rehabilitate them. We had those debates in this country, and I think is there anything worth killing someone for, and what does that say about the nation, the state and the nation that you come from? These families, these young men have made a terrible mistake that has had very big consequences, and would have had big consequences, of course, had they not been caught as well for many Australians. But I think it's a nature of our civil society, or a measure of our civil society, that we have abolished the death penalty in this country, and I think that all of us are certainly pleading that the Indonesian government sees some sense at the 11th hour and does not execute these young men, and the power potentially of the message that they send to other people about what not to do and their story and about how they have rehabilitated in prison, I think will be an important one, but one that won't be told if they die this week.
All right, we've got a few questions on this topic. We'll go to, before we bring the rest of the panel in, we'll go to Gillian Hogan.
With the imminent deaths of Mr Chan and Mr Suku Warren, what will be the response from the government to the Indonesian government in relation to foreign aid and tourism?
I'll start with Greg Sheridan, who's written about this recently. Maybe not will be the response, but what do you think should be the response or could be the response?
Well, Tony, this is very difficult because you've got two conflicting impulses here, both of which are right. The government must do something substantial to show its displeasure with Indonesia over this if Indonesia goes ahead and kills 2 Australians. But not only is this a tragedy for the 2 young men, this is a terrible tragedy for Indonesia. I love Indonesia. I love the Australian-Indonesian relationship. So the government shouldn't do anything which destroys the Australia-Indonesia relationship. But I think what this matter brings up is that this is a terrible tragedy for Indonesia and indicates an awful weakness in President Jokowi, who is already really in a kind of political crisis. You know, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, he's a bit like John Howard. People were sick of him at the end, but by God, he looks good in retrospect. And after
he put a sort of unofficial ban on executions for quite a long time, didn't he?
He did.
I mean, and we're now seeing a change, but why?
Well, after the last of the Bali bombers were executed, I think in 2008, SBY was personally revolted by the business of executions, and he didn't execute anyone again until 2013. And then there was a very small number of executions in 2013. Now, SBY was strong enough to do that against popular opinion and against the general outrage that the average Indonesian citizen feels at the drugs trade. Of course, it is the sad truth that corrupt Indonesian police are at the centre of the Indonesian drugs trade. Now, I think Jokowi is emerging already, and I say this with no pleasure, as a weak president who is caught between the demands of populism on one hand and the machinations of traditional Jakarta elite politicians, Megawati Soekarno-Putri, Prabowo Subianto, and he's not strong enough to exercise the de facto clemency which SBY exercised.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, I concur on all of the points that have been made. Can I just say this, and perhaps if I can just address this to the Indonesian government. It is not a sign of weakness to spare the lives of these men. Yes, they have committed very terrible crimes. And yes, they knew that the death penalty was there if they were caught and found guilty. But it is not weak to spare their lives. It is a sign of the strongest love, the greatest mercy when you extend it to those who least deserve it. That is a sign of strength. President Jokowi can be so strong that he does not have to take the lives of 2 men, but to give them life to continue to rehabilitate, to repent for the rest of their days.
I've got to ask you this because the questioner asked what action should the Australian government take. I think you meant after the execution, and that's indeed how Greg Sheridan addressed that question. But what about before the execution? Surely you'd want to take action which stopped it happening.
Well, as Tony Abbott said today or yesterday, in making your submissions to the Indonesian government, you have to be careful that what you do is not actually counterproductive. No government likes being pushed around by another government. So the arguments you've got to explain sincerely how the depth of feeling in Australia, and you saw that with the unanimous vote of the House of Representatives calling for the Indonesian government to extend clemency and not execute these men. It's important that friends speak honestly with each other and that we explain to the Indonesians how deeply we feel about it and how Australians will be hurt by these men being executed. But equally, threats and so forth could be very, very counterproductive. And that's why, as I said in the House of Representatives, and I say again tonight, I think, Greg has just said that President Jokowi is already looking like a weak president. Well, you are a foreign affairs expert, and I will not comment on that. But I would say this, that an Indonesian president that had the strength to say, as SBY said, we are a big enough, a great enough, a good enough country not to have to execute criminals. We don't have to lower ourselves to the business of putting up convicted criminals in front of a firing squad and shooting them. We are bigger than that. We have a bigger love, we have a greater mercy than any of their crimes. And that's why we don't lower ourselves to kill them. That's a sign of strength. And I hope that in the next little while, the President of Indonesia shows this great strength, the strength of mercy.
We have a specific question to Bryan Stevenson on this subject from Elise Trewick.
Hi. Do you believe that nations have a right to interfere with another country's execution of their own criminal punishment, especially in the death penalty?
I do. I mean, I think that for many years, many states would not extradite people to America if they were going to face the death penalty. I think states do have an obligation to seek the kind of broad commitment to basic human rights that most countries subscribe to. It's not unprecedented. The international norms that have been adopted and enforced around the world, I think, have had a really profound impact on protecting the rights of disfavored people, advancing human rights. And in that respect, I think it's not only appropriate, but necessary that foreign governments provide services to people who are foreign nationals. Indonesia is doing that on behalf of Indonesian nationals, right? They are acting on their behalf. And so I think it's entirely appropriate that we do that. But I also want to just kind of reinforce what Mr. Turnbull just said, because I do think that the most profound expression of strength and commitment to basic human rights is when you do not engage in these kinds of really cruel and barbaric practices. I have stood next to people who are within 72 hours of an execution. It is cruel, it is barbaric. It's barbaric for everybody involved, including the people who participate in these executions. And I think for me, at least, what my work has taught me, and this is in response to Emily's question as well, I think we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. That's what my work has taught me. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If they take something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even when you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And these two men are not just drug dealers. And we can't execute just drug dealers when there's more to it. They're human beings. They're Australian citizens. And it's all of that other stuff that I think we have to protect in all circumstances. And it's another reason why I think our strongest gesture is to recognize that a civil society, a society committed to human rights, doesn't engage in killing its citizens.
Bryan, if we can't convince the United States that this is a barbaric form of punishment, a beacon of democracy, how are we going to convince a new democracy like Indonesia, which actually takes its lead from countries like the United States?
Well, I agree that America has been a terrible witness on this issue, but I think that there is a need for resistance. I mean, we couldn't. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. and people protested. The civil rights movement in America began with a boycott, with people choosing, making a hard choice not to ride the buses so they could push the society to protect the rights of people who are disfavored. I can't speak to what the right response will be for the Australian government, but we cannot be indifferent to violations of human rights. America changed when people change, when protests change. South Africa changed when protests change. Countries around the world that continue to violate human rights change when the rest of the world stands up and says something clear and definitive about the unacceptability of that conduct.
I'm just going to go quickly to Greg again. Now, listening, do you think the Indonesians will in any way be moved by the kind of appeals we're hearing tonight to common humanity?
To be honest with you, Tony, I don't. And I do think this is a terrible tragedy, but of course Indonesia is not alone in having the death penalty. I think we need to keep even our justifiable anger in some sense of proportion. I don't think Jokowi would have let this get to where it is if he was going to change his mind now. I agree with what Bryan and Malcolm are saying, that it would show great strength, but in fact to do it now would look as though he was succumbing to Australian pressure. SBY was strong enough to stop the execution. He was not quite strong enough to abolish the policy of execution. And sad to say, around Asia, execution is still very, very common in China, in Vietnam, in Singapore, in Malaysia. It's not an uncommon practice. And Indonesia was kind of, in many respects, Indonesia is leading the way in Southeast Asia with democracy now, and it was leading the way on this issue. And I think Jokowi is letting it fall back a bit.
All right, Q&A is live across Australia. It's simulcast on ABC News 24, News Radio and Australia Plus. Our next question tonight comes from Petra Hilton.
It would appear that the father of the House, Philip Ruddock, is being used as a scapegoat for the Prime Minister's unpopularity, being sacked for failure to whip up support for the PM in the 60 hours prior to the spill vote, while Tony Abbott has had 17 months to whip up support for his Prime Ministership and has failed miserably to do so. Has the wrong man been sacked?
Lisa Wilkinson.
This came at the end of a week when the Prime Minister said that we were about to have good government, and I think everybody had exactly the same reaction. So what have we been having for the last 16 or 17 months? And I think the problem that Tony Abbott has now is that there are so many own goals. I mean, there's almost a laundry list now from... And having interviewed the Prime Minister many times, you know, most particularly also when he was opposition leader, he was a very effective opposition leader because he was really good at tearing down the government. But one of the strongest messages that he would come back with during our interviews was Julia Gillard broke a promise. We will not break promises. So we've got broken promises on no cuts to pensions, no cuts to the ABC or SBS, no cuts to education. The submarine contracts look like they've been broken. It's just been one thing after the other. And then we've had silly mistakes and silly decisions like the knighting of Prince Philip. This is a man who's got 30 knighthoods. And I think if you were to poll any number of Australians walking down George Street right now and you said, of all of the royal family, who do you think has the closest connection to the average Aussie? I think Prince Philip wouldn't even make the top 50.
You're not talking about Prince Philip Ruddock here, are you?
No. But you know, in terms of, you know, these own goals, the Prime Minister, even after he said good government the other day, he said that the question was not whether or not the Australian people thought that Prince Philip getting that award was appropriate, it's whether the award was appropriate. Now, these are the awards that the Prime Minister brought back from the dark ages, and the definition was that they had to be an Australian receiving the awards. Now, last time I looked, he was Greek-British. So there's been so many things, and you know, Tony Abbott only has to look in the mirror to see why he's having so many problems. And on the issue of Philip Ruddock, I would have thought it's the Prime Minister's job to be in touch with his backbench. He couldn't have been reading a newspaper, and he certainly couldn't have been talking to anybody in the backbench, because we all knew, everyone in this room, everyone watching knew that he had real issues with the backbench, and 40% of the people who sit behind him don't want him there as leader.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Right, well, thank you. Thanks, Lisa.
Amazing how a mere name.
Yeah, thank you. So kind of you to. Look,
I'm happy
let
to
me
go
just
in
say,
if you
let me
want.
say, Catherine King's very happy to
I'm
answer this
happy to
question.
rescue you.
Let me just say this to you, re Philip Ruddock. Philip Ruddock is the father of the House, means he's been in Parliament for over 40 years. He's the longest serving member of the House of Representatives. He was an outstanding minister in the Howard government, notably as Immigration Minister and Attorney General. He is one of the absolute icons of the Liberal Party. He is well loved. He is well respected. He is esteemed by all of the Liberal Party right across the country. And look, Tony Abbott, as Philip said, is entitled to appoint and replace the Chief Whip as and when he wishes. That's his call. But I have to say, I was very sad to see the announcement. I think, well, Tony, you know, it was Tony's call, right? So he's the one that has to explain it. But I just want to say that I think Philip Ruddock is a great Liberal, a great parliamentarian, and it was a very sad day for all of us when we learnt that he had been, his services as Chief Whip had been terminated and by the Prime Minister.
So was it a mistake to sack such a respected figure like Philip Ruddock without ceremony or speeches late on a Friday afternoon, which we all as journalists know is known as take out the trash day? The day when you do the difficult things when no one's watching.
Well, was it a mistake?
For him to do it, yeah. And for him to do it in that
look,
manner.
Really, that is.
This is actually a question for your opinion.
Yeah, and I know it is a question for my opinion, and I'm happy to share my opinions on lots of things, but I'm not going to share my opinions on my colleagues.
You just shared all the good opinion about your colleagues.
I'm happy to speak well of my colleagues, but I'm not going to run a commentary on the Prime Minister's decisions. I mean, look, he didn't consult me. I don't know who he consulted. He's the boss. He's the captain. He can make a captain's call. Well, that's his description of it. It's true. It is true. If you're the Prime Minister, there's a bunch of decisions you can take, and how you take them and who you consult with is a matter for you, and whether the decisions are right or wrong, time and public opinion, no doubt, and other events will determine. But I'm not going to. All I'm prepared to say about Philip Ruddock is what a fine man he is, and I was very sad to see his services terminated in that role. Full stop.
Catherine King.
That was a very long yes, Malcolm, I thought then. Look, I think the real issue here is, not what Tony Abbott's done this week. It's about the story about the budget and about the policies of the government. If the backbench or anyone thinks that the electorate is angry at them just because of Tony Abbott, you're deluding yourselves. Wherever you go, people will tell you this is an unfair budget, and the legacy of that is just eking its way through the government. And so you can change Tony. Malcolm, if you manage to get the spot at any point in time, then it's going to be the policies that you've brought to the electorate. It's the broken promises. It really is what you're actually trying to sell. I think, unfortunately, where the Liberal Party is today is gone much further to the right than it has been previously. So it's going to be very difficult for any new leader, particularly one who may be a bit more progressive than the current leadership group, to actually move on things like climate change, to be able to move and look at how do you actually make sure that you do protect those important institutions like Medicare. So it's not really, to me, about Abbott. It's about what you're trying to do to the Australian people, and they don't like it.
I'm going to bring it back to Greg Sheridan now. You've actually suggested someone else who should be sacked, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Peter Credlin. Why do you take that view? Why is it her fault, in your view, or why should she be sacrificed for bad decisions by a Prime Minister?
Well, I didn't suggest she should be sacked. I think she should move out of her current position. I think she should do so with full honour. She's a very good person. She's given her all to her job and to her leader. But look, I think on the whole, the Abbott government has tried to pursue good policy. Now, it's not a great secret that the Prime Minister's an old friend of mine, and I think he's a terrific bloke. I think he's a really good human being. He's a first-rate person, and I'll go to my grave always defending that. Having said that, it's been a government of conspicuous political mismanagement, with some exceptions, obviously. But
by the way, was the Ruddock decision mismanagement in your view?
Look, or at
least the manner in which it was done?
Well, look, I don't have a strong view about it really one way or the other, but I do think the government overall has been pursuing good policy, but it's very often pursued good policy with disastrous political consequences. On climate change, it is where the public wants to be, rejecting an economy-crippling tax, but taking the science seriously. The public suspects that the Prime Minister doesn't believe in the science, and with no disrespect, Malcolm, it suspects that Malcolm doesn't believe in the policy. And this is kind of replicated, not between Malcolm and Tony, but all across the government, it's been pursuing good policy, but with disastrous political mismanagement. Now, I think the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister's office has been running the political show. Politically, it's been a shambles. And the Chief of Staff has to take responsibility for it. Also, every single practising journalist, I was late to write this, I forbore from writing it, but every single practising journalist has been inundated with tales of bad relationships between the Prime Minister's office, right across the party, and with the business community. Now, my worry for the Prime Minister, who I think has the makings still of a very fine Prime Minister, is that even today he doesn't fully grasp the depth of the crisis which he and his government are in. And one of the things you do in a crisis is make big changes, change the equations fundamentally. And getting the Chief of Staff to move on honourably, I certainly wouldn't sack her, but moving her into a different role or something would be part of recognising and reconfiguring.
Look, important though Peter Credlin and indeed Philip Ruddock and indeed Tony Abbott are, the most important thing is something that Catherine raised, which is the budget. Now, I recognise that the Labor Party do not agree with the measures that we've introduced to bring the budget back into balance. And Catherine, you're perfectly entitled to disagree with them. But the bottom line is this, that in the 6 years of Labor, the Labor Party spent $2 additional dollars of expenditure for every $1 additional dollar of revenue. That's why we are in the red. That's why we've got a deficit. That's our financial problem. Now, the question for you tonight is, you don't like our measures. You've opposed them all in the Senate and you've blocked a lot of them with the support of the independents. What are you going to do about the budget? I mean, or do you believe there's not a problem at all?
OK, I'm just going to interrupt you because we will come back to that issue. And by the way, generally speaking, however, the questions come from the audience.
I'm happy to answer.
We know you have a dark past as a journalist, but you still don't get to do it. Our next question.
There should be some response.
Our next question is well, you'll get a chance. Our next question on this subject is from Zach Solomon.
Following the recent leadership spill, Tony Abbott stated that good government starts today. Despite this, we've experienced yet another week of unpopular decisions, captains, calls and gaffes. Does the panel believe that we are witnessing the end of Tony Abbott's tenure as leader of the Liberal Party and Prime Minister? And if so, who do you believe would replace him? Is the person in this room?
I'd like to declare my candidacy. If called upon, I am willing to serve.
The Sheridan age.
You've got to be voted in first. Lisa.
Details.
Because I'm a journalist, just like Malcolm used to be a journalist, I would love to know the answer to the question, because we were all watching
only for the audience?
On Monday. Well, no. This certainly buys into Zach's question.
Right.
I would love to know, why did you walk into that leadership spill all on your own?
Well, I wasn't challenging anybody. I was.
No, but everybody else in the party walked in with Tony Abbott.
Well, no, that's not actually.
Choreography
strictly speaking, Lisa,
that?
that's not true. Because Scott Morrison walked in with someone else. He didn't walk in with Tony Abbott, and so every time someone walked in with a member of another member, or walked out with another member, people speculated on what that was all about.
Look, I feel quite safe at Parliament House, and I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy to wander around the corridors by myself, you know. I mean, there are members of the Labor Party lurking everywhere. But you know, I feel I'm safe tonight in Catherine's company and any of her colleagues.
I've sold you short. You looked a bit like Noddy No Friends. and clearly you're not, if what we're hearing is the truth. Do you know
Noddy 39 friends?
Can I ask another question? Does anybody know who cast the informal vote, and was it you?
Well, it was a secret ballot, but I don't think I've ever cast an informal vote.
You don't think, or you...
No, sorry, I beg your pardon. I have never cast an informal vote.
Okay,
sorry.
all right. Now, just in case you do take over the show, I'm going to go to Greg Sheridan to see if we can get an answer to Zach's question, which was, really, I mean, you did forecast serious problems for Tony Abbott. Do you think he may have reached the end of his premiership?
Well, look, you know, it's painful sometimes when you've known someone for a very, very long time. But as a journalist, you're paid to tell the truth and to write the truth. And you're no good if you don't. It's quite clear the leadership is in play. It's quite clear the leadership is in play. I think Tony has a 50-50 chance of staying as leader. I think if he were to lose support definitively, it's very likely the party would ask Malcolm Turnbull to take the leadership. That's what I think.
And Malcolm Turnbull, do you think that?
Well, I'll you know, tempting though it is to venture into the minefield you're luring me into, I think I'll pass on that one.
Do you suspect that the entire voting public out there is actually hanging on the answer to that question?
I suspect they've got more important things to worry about, and I know I'm being a bit persistent about this, but if Catherine King and the Labor Party don't like our way of sorting out the budget mess we inherited, what is their alternative? I mean, there's going to be an election in 18 months. They're ahead in the polls. You could be in government, Catherine. At some point you're going to have to say either there's no problem at all, in which case people will think you are in the denial business in a very big way, or you're going to have to say, you know, we're going to fix the budget deficit by putting up taxes or by cancelling these concessions or by cutting that expenditure. I mean, we've laid our program out on the table, honestly, and I grant you, a lot of it has not been very popular.
Malcolm, I promise you, before you try and get back into that interviewer's role, and Catherine, you too, we will come to that question.
Letting her off the hook. I mean,
I'm very happy to answer.
She's very keen to answer it. Let her do it.
There are questions on this subject, and I'm not going to let you actually tell us where we're going in the show. Let's move along. Our next question comes from Jane Healy.
Mr Turnbull.
Yes.
I am a weekly visitor to Villawood Detention Centre, and I know some of the children that have been mentioned in the recently released report by the Australian Human Rights Commission. I know an 8-year-old who attempted suicide by eating rocks and screws and bolts from the tents that he lived in for 14 months on Nauru. I know a 14-year-old who attempted to hang herself. I would ask you personally to justify the irreparable damage that's being done to hundreds of children still in detention.
Okay, well, let me give you a few numbers on this, and can I just say to you, there's a lot of talk about politics and, you know, personalities and so forth. The real issue here is the children and the welfare of the children. But let's just look at a few numbers. When the Howard government was voted out in 2007, there were no children in detention. The Labor Party overturned John Howard's very successful policy on stopping people smuggling. As a consequence, as we know, there were tens of thousands of arrivals. At its peak, under Labor, there were 2,000 children in detention. At the time of the election, when we came into government, there were just under 1,400. Now, there are 136. So we, with our policies, have reduced the number of children in detention by 90%.
Can I just say, first of all, that figure's wrong. Sorry. That figure's wrong. That is the number of, that is the figure.
There's 211 in detention in Australia, and there's 119 in detention in Peru.
No, there is 136 children in detention.
I'm reading from the report.
Well,
the report's out of date.
It's out of date. There are 136 as of 12 p.m. today. There are 192 as of last Thursday. There are 1,992 at the peak under Labor in 2013.
I've got to interrupt you again.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is the up-to-date information.
No, there's a misapprehension here because Peter Dutton did release figures of 192 children in detention today, but he left out the children in detention offshore on Nauru.
Exactly.
135 children
No,
there.
there are
So
136 children in detention.
Well,
anyway, look, I'm sorry. I have this information from Peter Dutton himself today. But the bottom line, look, listen, let's not quibble.
Does that mean that all the children in Nauru have been released?
No, but Tony, this is the absurdity of your querulousness. I mean, really, the Labor Party had a massively failed border protection policy, which they abandoned themselves, right? The consequence of that policy was hundreds of people drowning at sea, tens of thousands of people coming to Australia, a couple of thousand children in detention, and what we have done is get most of those children out, and we are getting them out as quickly as we can.
Okay, I'm just...
that is the truth.
The querulousness was simply about the figures, that's all. Now we're going to hear from Catherine King.
Let's talk about the children.
That's right.
Let's talk about the children.
Exactly.
Catherine King should at least answer the questions you've raised, and they are legitimate questions.
Look, I think the Human Rights Commission report is an indictment on both of us. It is an indictment on both of us. This is not the system. This is not who we are as Australians. And I know that the Labor Party in government, we did try to have a more compassionate policy, and yes, we did see a large number of boats arrive, and that did mean there are a lot of people in detention. But now we have a Human Rights Commission report before us that says there are children suffering today because they are in detention. Now, the response of the government, which you have just echoed then, is to then go and, well, Labor did this, Labor did that, and then to blame the Human Rights Commissioner and attack her.
I haven't said anything about her at all.
You haven't, and I acknowledge that you haven't, and as a lawyer I suspect you would be very careful about doing so as well. But the Prime Minister, who is your leader, has done exactly that. That's the response of the government. What the response of the government should be is about, well, what are we doing to get them out? How are we actually making them safe? What do we need to do?
But can I just ask you, just on Malcolm Turnbull's point, there are almost 2,000 children in detention at the peak of your government's policy on this issue. Why wasn't that the fundamental debate that you and others were fighting at the time you were in government?
Well,
why is it only now out of government that this has become a huge issue for you?
Many of us internally were, and that's exactly, you are right to raise that. And I know that there was work being done to get them out as quickly as possible. Is that good enough? Clearly the Human Rights report says no.
Bryan, I'm just going to bring you in as an outsider. I sidelined you for most of the political leadership debate because it didn't seem fair. But can you reflect on what you've seen here? Children in detention, did you expect to find that in Australia?
Well, it troubles me, but I think that, this is not an uncommon debate. I mean, we have suffered in America from the politics of fear and anger, where people posture politically around a big issue and that there are casualties in the middle, and I think that's what's happened here. So I do think that the challenge really has to be, how do we protect children? And it doesn't, from my perspective, of course, I'm not an Australian. It doesn't matter sort of who the political party is. It doesn't matter how we got here. We've got to figure out how we get where we are, from where we are to where we want to go. And no child should be under these conditions and circumstances. We've got some 3,000 children in adult jails and prisons, and it's horrific. The suicide rate is through the roof. Kids are traumatized. They are scarred in ways that we are responsible for putting children in that situation. So I think it's an immediate question of how do we get out of that. And there are some really good programs around the world. Refugee children in many societies are shielded from whatever the immigration policy is that's going to create suffering and abuse. So we've got some programs in the States where we actually pull children. We put them in schools, we provide them with services, we offer them counseling, we facilitate relationships with their parents, even if they're undocumented and illegal. I think you always, in a just society, have an obligation to protect children. In some ways, it's society's first obligation. And all children are children. It doesn't matter whether they're born in another country. It doesn't matter if their parents came to the country illegally. They're children. And if you don't protect children, you are really sowing the seeds of a society that's at risk with itself. I don't think you should do nothing except quarrel about the politics that give rise to these policies. That's a recipe for sustaining the problem. And I think in many ways there are some immediate things that could be done. And I think the Human Rights Commission report painted a picture that might have allowed that to happen. I do think it's a mistake to silence the reporting of these kinds of problems, even if it's a little out of date, because it can create a sort of resolve to shield a country from these problems replicating.
I'd like to hear on Gillian Trigg's report specifically, because we're running out of time, and I want to hear. Let me just put it as a question: do you share Tony Abbott's view the Children in Detention report was a blatantly partisan, politicised exercise?
Look, I'm not going to buy into that. The real issue is the children.
So when you say you're not going to buy into it,
I'm not going to run a commentary on my colleagues. I just want to make this. I just want to make a very important point. And I've discussed this at some length with the Immigration Minister, Peter Dutton, today, who has been successful, as indeed was Scott Morrison, in getting kids out of detention. The reason children are in detention is obviously they're with their families, their mother and father, typically. The reason why they're still there, in most cases, is because the mother and the children have been offered the opportunity to move out of detention, but do not want to leave the father in detention, and the father is the authorities may wish to keep him in detention because of security issues and matters of that kind. So that is the look. I'm just telling you what the Immigration Minister, both of them, have said to me about this. They are absolutely working very hard to get all of these kids out of detention, and I'm not suggesting that you send them a bunch of flowers, but you've got to give them credit. They have reduced the number of children in detention by 90%. By 90%. Now, we want it to be 100%, and we're going to do our very level best to get there. So please believe, we all have children, or we were children. We've got enough empathy to understand how dreadful it must be for children to be in detention. It is our objective to have no children in detention. And of course, the best way to do that is to stop this people smuggling trade. Because see, the problem that Catherine's party had was that while people like Chris Bowen were moving kids out of detention at one end, out the back door, if you like, the people smuggler boats were coming, bringing more children in the front door. Now, we've managed to close that, and so we can now move the children out. And
when will the children be out?
Well, as quickly as possible. But you see, can I just say to you, I'm not asking that you send Dutton and Morrison, a bouquet or a Christmas card or anything like that. But you've got to give the Abbott government credit for having reduced the number of children in detention by 90%. I mean, we left government in 2007. There were no children in detention. Labor ended up with 2,000. When they went out, there was just under 1,400. Now there's 136. Now, that is progress. It's not 100%, I grant you, but you've got to give us some credit for taking this issue seriously and addressing it in a way that Labor plainly did not.
All right, we've got to move on. Malcolm.
Very quickly, the problem is the response to this Human Rights Commission report coming out was all about the politics. Now, the irony is this report was called The Forgotten Children, and all of the rhetoric forgot the children.
I hope it's quite clear. You should... Look, can I just say this, Lisa? Judge us by our actions. The one thing that is clear is that as a government, we have not forgotten the children because we are moving them out. There were 192 last week, 136 now, and there'll be less the next week. It is, I promise you, Peter Dutton is focused on getting those kids out of detention as quickly as he can.
And you have no opinion at all about Gillian Trigg's report?
Well, I've read the executive summary of the report. I know there are issues. The argument is that it should have been undertaken when the Labor Party was in power and so forth. But really, Gillian Triggs is a legal academic. She's got a distinguished career as a legal academic. I know she's been a controversial head of the Human Rights Commission. But really, that's not important. With all due respects to Gillian Triggs, the real issue is the children. And the fact is that we have got the runs on the board. We have got children out of detention. Labor put them in.
OK, let's move on to that issue that Malcolm Turnbull has been keen to address. So keen, he's tried to cross-examine our other panellists. This question comes from Kate Golder.
My question is to the Communications Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. Minister, as a financial planner and a small business owner, I appreciate the importance of balancing a budget more than most. However, I've become increasingly dismayed over the past 18 months about the inability of the government to make a public case for reform, and concerned that following the Queensland election, tough budget measures will be placed in the too hard basket. In today's political climate, do you still believe budget repair and sensible economic reform is possible? And if so, how can it be done without being voted out of government?
Well, that's a really good question. And let me say to you, what we need to do is this is a bit of a mea culpa. We, as a government, have to do a better job at explaining the problem that we face. We do have a budgetary problem. You know, we're spending more than we're receiving in revenue. And we've set out how we'd address it. And as I said earlier, obviously Labor doesn't like it, but they haven't put up their alternative. But let me say that is just a subset of the big question. The big question is this: how do we here in Australia maintain our standard of living, our high wage, generous social welfare net economy in a more competitive, globalised world where we've got developing countries that are competing in a way that they couldn't do before, where the internet makes so many goods, so many industries and businesses trade exposed? And the answer is we have to be more productive, we have to be smarter, we have to be more innovative, we have to be more cost effective at every level. And that's, you know, one of the reasons I'm addressing the digital transformation of government. It's not just to save some money at government. If you make the government more efficient, that's about a third of the economy, you can make, that will then influence the rest of the economy. We have to, everything we do has to be designed to ensure that our prosperity is secure, and that is by being more productive, more innovative, smarter, faster, leaner, all of those things. And the reason for that, it's not a hair shirt, it's because that's how we ensure that our kids will have good jobs, our grandkids will have good jobs. That is our future. It's a really competitive world. More competition, but you know something? So many more opportunities. But they'll only be attainable by us if we go for that growth that comes from productivity, competitiveness, innovation. That is what this budget repair thing is all about. It's not just about, you know, austerity. It's not just about paying off debt. It is about making us a stronger, healthier economy for a better future for all of us.
So the questioner asked about issues being put in the too hard basket, possibly. Last week, the Prime Minister said the hockey budget was too bold and too ambitious. So I'm just wondering, are the key budget measures that have failed to pass through the Senate, do they pass, or they fail to pass a kind of equity test as well, in your view?
Well, I think I think there have been two problems, if you like, on the fairness side with the budget. Again, being very frank with you. I think the first one was that we did not do a good enough job explaining what the problem was. And in other words, that there was a budgetary problem to begin with. Now, that may seem pretty obvious, but a lot of people didn't accept that there was a problem. If we had got that message across, of course, would have put real pressure on Labor when they said we don't like Abbott and Hockey's measures to say, well, here are our, you know, to say what theirs were. So I think that's the first part of it. And obviously there are always issues about, from a distributional side, you know, is this group having to bear too much of the pain versus that group? And that's all of those things have got to be argued.
Were mistakes made there? That's the key question about equity?
I think the fact that we haven't been able to get a lot of this through means that mistakes have been made. You know, the great lawmaker Solon, who wrote the first laws of Athens, the first legislator, we all learned about him at law school. He was asked, they said, Solon, are these laws you've given Athens the best laws? And he said, they are the best laws the Athenians will accept. And the fact is that you've got to get your laws through. You've got to get the public to accept them, you've got to get the parliament to accept them. So We just have to do a better job of advocacy.
I'm just going to quickly get Greg Sheridan's view on whether you think the public's ready now for Solon rather than hockey.
Well, you know, at times I think the government has made the economic debate needlessly complex. It's been like Duns Scotus explaining the Immaculate Conception or something. But I would say to you, there is, to use the old Marxist terms, there are subjective problems and objective problems. Malcolm's outlined the subjective problems. What I think of the objective problems is we are becoming a very difficult country to govern. You know, these Green senators, when they oppose indexing excise on petrol, that would be a core Green belief everywhere in the world. They oppose it because they want to hurt Tony Abbott. These Palmer United Party senators, if you can find any shred of coherence to the bizarre gyrations. Now, our Senate system guarantees you're going to have people like that in the Senate, more or less forevermore. As well as that, you've got social media, which means any party in government is going to have the extreme elements of its base much louder in dissatisfaction with not going far enough in whatever the direction is, which is going to hurt it with the centre. Now, I thought the failures of the Rudd and Gillard governments indicated a failure in the culture of the Labor Party. I'm beginning to worry that we are losing the culture of governing ourselves well. And I think
Tony Abbott says,
problem.
to use the old communist term, as you put it, they're going to socialise decision-making in the party now. Is that going to work?
Well, I mean, it's worth a try. The other style didn't work.
All right, Catherine
Thanks.
King. Now, there are a lot of issues which have been raised. This is your chance to sort of put your position.
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing I'd say is that the Liberal Party before the election said the impossible in essence. They said they weren't going to put up taxes, they weren't going to cut expenditure on health or education, and they were going to have a surplus. Now, you can't have all of those things. That's the reality.
That's a sort of point you made earlier. So I'm going to bring you to the question that Malcolm Turnbull put to you, which is that Labor has all these wonderful policies but doesn't seem to have any way to fund them. So when are you going to tell us how you're going to do that?
So I think the first thing to say is we have actually passed a number of budget measures, including in health, that have actually been savings measures. So I will say that, including we supported, which wasn't a budget measure, but which was something that we thought was a good idea to do in government, which was the pharmaceutical benefits scheme reform. So there's been $20 billion worth of savings that we have actually passed. Now, I have spent the last 18 months holding policy forums across the country on primary care, on prevention, on health financing, all of those things to develop our policies. And we will certainly announce those in the course of the year. We have said that very clearly, we will do so. But again, it seems extraordinary to me when it comes to health policy in particular. There is not a health economist in the country that will tell you what the government has done is the right thing when it comes to health policy. Not a health economist in the country.
But are there any health economists who can, or any economists at all, who can explain how Labor is going to pay for its massive policies, which run into tens of billions of extra spending in the years leading up to 2020?
What we did in government was find substantial savings in health. Private health insurance rebate means testing was not an easy thing to do. It was something these guys opposed and say that they're going to reverse when they get the opportunity to do so. That was a big area of savings. Pharmaceutical benefits scheme reform. Also, we copped a lot of pressure from the pharmacists when we did that, has seen substantial savings there. There are lots of ideas within health around what you might do, but what people tell you very clearly you do not do is you do not try and make it harder for people to go and see the cheapest part of the system, which is our general practitioners. That is not smart health policy reform. And I think one of the problems the government has had is you haven't actually had a health policy framework to actually explain what you're trying to do, what it is you're trying to achieve across the entire Commonwealth expenditure for health, not just the Medicare benefit schedule and one component of it. We're in the process of working all of that up. Your government has spent the last 18 months at war with the doctors, at war with patients, and has had no health policy as a result of that, and is really in the point where it's now going back and saying, oh, we'll consult. What have you been doing for the last 18 months, really?
Well, but at the end of that, we still don't know. But Catherine, you know,
you want me to announce?
I take all that on the chin.
I'm not going to announce them here, mate.
We still don't know. We've had one budget, we're about to have another. We still don't know how you are going to address the fact that we have this growing deficit this growing debt as a consequence, and you haven't provided us any answers there. Look, I mean, when I was opposition leader back in 2009, we opposed one of your measures, and it related to health. It was a cutback on the Medicare, the private health insurance rebate.
Yep.
And we opposed that, and we proposed an alternative measure. Actually, I think it was slugging the poor old smokers with extra cigarette excise, tobacco excise.
Which isn't hypothecated to health, by the way, so you know that.
But I did that.
Yep.
I did that because I wanted to say, we're responsible, we don't agree with that item in yours, which would leave a hole, so therefore we've got another way of getting the revenue. You have never done that.
Yep.
You've never done that.
But don't forget,
this is sort of unfunded empathy we're getting from you.
Not a dollar, not a single dollar that you are hitting patients with is going back into the health system. Not a dollar. It's not going back into making Medicare sustainable. It's going into your medical research future fund.
That old medical research thingy. That's not.
So, Catherine, because you're obviously working at high levels in your own party, and I no doubt you'll want to know what revenue-raising measures are going to be put in place to pay for your policies. Do you have any idea at this stage?
Certainly, we've been working that through, but I'm not going to announce them on Q&A tonight.
So you have some idea. There are big revenue-raising measures in prospect. Is that right?
There's certainly work done, and you would have seen from the Shadow Treasurer last Q&A. We know there are challenges in the budget. We know there are challenges in the budget. What we are saying is the measures that you have put in place in your last budget are fundamentally unfair. To slug pensioners while you're allowing multinationals tax loopholes. I mean, really? That's not where we want to go. We're working our way through those, and of course we'll have plenty to say on that in the course of the year.
Okay, we've got time for one last question. This one comes from Anne Greaves.
Every week we watch the politicians on the panel wriggle, squirm, obfuscate, sidestep and avoid the questions that we ask them. Is it any wonder that confidence in the governance of our country is at an all-time low? It's therefore with scepticism that I ask Mr Turnbull if he can tell us what he honestly thinks is needed to restore the faith of Australians in the political party process, to stop the negativity of oppositional politics and govern for the future to rebuild the nation's self-belief.
Okay, well, Malcolm Turnbull's had quite a lot to say. No, Malcolm, just wait a minute. I will bring you in, but I want to hear from the other panellists as well, so we'll start with Lisa. What do you think about that? It's a fundamental question. How can you restore faith in politics?
I think the government has got to start communicating with itself. I think we're seeing that there is a real problem with the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing. Even down to just in this last week, we heard the Prime Minister say that he's going to go softly on what he puts through Parliament, hoping that it's going to get through the Senate, whereas Joe Hockey said that he was going to stick with the existing budget that he had. So there's a disconnect there between two of the most senior people in the government. So I think miscommunication is a real problem within the existing government.
Greg.
Well, two things, Tony, real briefly. One, breaking promises hurts credibility. There's no doubt about that. Even if they're stupid promises, breaking them really hurts credibility. But let me make a characteristic foreign editor's point. Right across the Western world at the moment, there is a crisis of governance. Look at the shambles of Europe. Look at the gridlock in the American Congress. Some of the factors I outlined before means that the power of nope is much greater than the power of hope. The power of blocking minorities, the power of stopping things. And I think this is a civilisational challenge. And what we're experiencing in Australia is one version of what's happening right across the Western world.
Actually, Bryan, I can bring you in at that point. I was going to bring you in later, but he's obviously raised the issue, the power of nope. I mean, Obama raised such high expectations in America. Oppositional politics and his own inadequacies as a manager, you could say, have caused terrible cynicism now to seep into American politics, as it has in other countries. What do you say? What are your reflections on this idea?
Well, I think the questioner actually has it exactly right. I think that there are two styles of leadership. One is to say, I'm the best leader because when I compare myself to the other potential candidates, I'm better than they are. And it's not really a forward-looking kind of leadership. It's a leadership rooted in the politics and posturing of who has power and who's trying to get it and who's going to keep it. And we've seen that in the States. I think Barack Obama came to prominence because he said, I'm going to be a different kind of leader. I have this vision, I have this hope. But our system is very, very corruptive. It very much is about compromise. I actually think great leadership comes when people show courage. I would like to see politicians do things that are not politically expedient, that require a vision, that sort of reflect a belief in things that they haven't necessarily seen, and that are difficult. And it's hard to, in an electoral system, be courageous. But ultimately, that's what the best presidents, the best leaders do. And I think that, what's interesting to me right now, just globally, and I think the comments have been made earlier are right. We're in a point now where everybody's so fragile and so determined to hold on to power that they forfeit leadership. And we need leadership. There are a lot of menacing challenges going on around the world. There are economic tensions, and the world is getting smaller. And so our governance actually has to get bigger. We can't afford to get mired down in the local politics of any given nation. We've got to begin to understand what it takes to provide the kind of resources and support for peoples around the world, many of whom have not had power before. And that's the challenge I think we have in America. I think that's the challenge we have in Australia. You need people to actually stand, even if everybody else is sitting. You need people who will speak, even if everybody else is quiet. And that conviction, that leadership is what I think unites a nation and makes people believe in governance again.
Catherine King, this obviously... This is fundamental not only for government but for opposition. Sure. I guess to put it to you and to pick up Bryan's point about courage, are we going to see courage from the opposition or just the usual small target carping from the sidelines?
Well, I think that if anything of the our previous time in government, and I suspect the Liberal Party are learning this hard and fast too, I think the issue around not breaking promises is pretty fundamental. I think people are prepared to reform. But what they're not prepared to accept is that you say one thing and then do completely the opposite, and I think that's problematic. But I do think, the question's a very, very important one, and in fact Malcolm and I were talking briefly about this before we came on stage. And I think there is some damage that we have done to each other by our constant carping at each other, not personally, but as parties, which is damaging politics in this country. And I don't know how we step back from that. I think that it probably takes a different leader from your part, I suspect, at some point, a less pugilistic sort of leader to be able to do that, to actually start to work with each other on common problems. Now, we're seeing that in national security. It's a very important issue that you can have bipartisan work on, but I think we've got a bit of thinking to do as a political body about how we want to be as politicians and how we actually behave. And so
I think that's also why that was such a great moment last week with Julie Bishop and Tanya Plibersek, totally bipartisan. We saw greatness, and
we're nearly out of time, so I've got to hear from Malcolm Turnbull on this key question.
Okay, I think firstly you have to set out a vision. Describe where you want to go. Well, what's this all about? What is your goal? You've got to explain that. That's absolutely critical. Then you've got to explain honestly, not dumbing it down, honestly, in the problems that we face. What is the problem with the budget? What is the problem with, dealing with the NBN or whatever? Pick a topic, but explain it and lay it out factually, and then lay out what the options are. And that's where, the honest debate we should be having with the Labor Party is about the budget, is one where we say, OK, we all know what the budget problem is. We're spending too much, spending more than we're receiving in revenue. Pretty obvious. OK, that can't go on forever. We've got to do something about it. We say, this is what we'd cut this spending, raise that revenue. And Labor would say, OK, no, we'd cut some other expenditure and raise some different revenue. Then we could have an honest debate. But we're not having that honest debate because, with all due respects to Catherine, who's playing her cards close to her chest at the moment, Labor is not prepared to actually tell us, either concede that there is a problem or tell us what their alternative policies are. And I think that I think there's responsibility on both sides. I think government and opposition should be prepared to put their cards on the table and say, and actually have a debate about the measures. And you never know, out of that debate, you might come up with a third solution that is better than either of those that are originally proposed.
Okay, we've got to go, but just quickly a question on that. Are you saying it's time for less partisan, more centrist leadership?
I think it is. I say this: Australian politics, Australian political contests are won or lost at the sensible centre, and look. This is a great nation, and we are a good people, and we are above all a sensible people. And we recognise that there are strong arguments on either side. But what we as politicians have to do is treat the people with respect. Don't slogan at them. Don't pretend problems don't exist. Lay out the problems. Explain what the problem is as clearly and concisely as you can, the latter being hard for me, as you've gathered, no doubt. And then you can have a debate about the options. And that, I think, that would then be an intelligent debate which respects the public. You see, sometimes politicians think that they're reaching out, to the electorate by dumbing everything down. I think that disrespects the electorate. I think the challenge for us as political communicators is to take complex problems and then explain them in a clear way, not in a simplistic way. We have got to be much better at explaining the problems, because once you've explained the problem, then people will accept the need for a solution, and then you'll have a competition about what the right solution is.
That is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel: Greg Sheridan, Malcolm Turnbull, Lisa Wilkinson, Bryan Stevenson, Catherine King. Thank you very much. Thank you. Next Monday, a special Q&A focused on family violence with Australian of the Year Rosie Batty, the Australian Ambassador for Women and Girls Natasha Stott-Despoja, the Acting Victorian Police Commissioner Tim Cartwright, and Indigenous sports broadcaster and long-time anti-violence campaigner Charlie King. Till next week's Q&A, good night.